there were 7 survivors of the Jedwabne pogrom, all saved by a Polish woman. So this story has been reported in Jan Tomasz Gross's book Sąsiedzi, subsequently published in English as Neighbours, the Distraction of the Jewish Community in Jedwabne, Poland. By giving Poles the story of Jedwabne, an unrequested and unthanked for gift, but thus a true gift in the Derridean sense, Gross seems to have distributed a gift in the German sense, a poisonous pharmacon that can also have curative properties. It's an aggressive gift, one whose productive, even if painful effects, will be felt in Poland and internationally for a long time. The story of the Jedwabne massacre, that massacre going back to 1941, left many Poles gasping. Some people were angry with the fact that Polishness was being slandered yet again. Some were disbelieving what they were hearing. Others became involved in the political and cultural work of investigation, reparation, and asking for forgiveness. For many Poles, it was difficult to talk about this issue without falling into either denial or rage. For years, the dominant tone in describing Polish-Jewish relations in Poland has been one of heroism, counting the righteous amongst the living, the Yad Vashem trees, the saved Jews. Yet Gross's book is also an alert that it's perhaps time to abandon the myth of Poland's both exceptionalism and Poland's innocence. Indeed, the romantic myths of Poland as the Christ of the nations, defending the weak and taking others' suffering upon herself, has to be confronted with the darker story of neighborly persecution, the withdrawal of hospitality. This confrontation, I suggest, is also an ethical condition for the emergence of a truly democratic culture and for developing more lively and engaged Polish-Jewish relations. So this premise that we have to go beyond the mathematical model of justice and start asking questions about neighborly relations, about traumas, about responsibility, and the withdrawal of hospitality, even if the main perpetrators were the Nazis, to start asking questions about the violence that went on the level between Polish Jews and Polish Gentiles, what kind of happened there. I think the premise informed the book I co-edited with a colleague and friend of mine, Dorota Głowacka, Imaginary Neighbours, Mediating Polish-Jewish Relations After the Holocaust. And as I mentioned in the introduction, I edited this book as a philosopher and cultural critic working on ethics, media, but not a Holocaust scholar, who was nevertheless deeply touched by Gross's book and by the kind of narrations that were prompted by that book, both in Poland and internationally. So that book is a response to the Jedwabne issue, a response that took the form of a conversation between a number of different scholars, psychoanalysts, journalists, literary historians. The book was originally published by the University of Nebraska Press in 2007, and it was just released again last month. We started from the assumption that to address Polish-Jewish relations responsibly and ethically, we need to supplement the methods and approaches of the historian with those of, developed by the psychoanalyst, the philosopher, and the cultural critic. Because the primary problem we are dealing with here is not the presence of facts and the material evidence confirming it, but rather a multiple loss, both of individual lives, be it 1,600 people who died in Jedwabne, or 3 million Polish Jews who died in the Holocaust, and of a chunk of Polish national identity and memory that was wiped out in the aftermath of the Shoah. As Polish cultural anthropologist Joanna Tokarska-Bakir observes, our memory is the place from which Jews are missing. So this is what our book Imaginary Neighbours and the paper I'm going to present today are attempting to do. So the paper is also an attempt to think about the issues of fratricide in a broader context of issues related to democracy, national memory, and ethics. Okay, so now for the paper proper. According to Benedict Anderson, any national community is a cultural and political artifact that provides a group of people with a sense of continuity and cohesiveness. The community proclaims itself through myth. We heard about that in the first presentation yesterday. The myth that tells the story of the community's inauguration and its continuing existence. Its members identify themselves with their relation to this mythical foundation. as it is continuously repeated in the rituals of remembrance. The force of the idea of the community is so strong that it's possible for its members to willingly die for such limited imaginings. If, as Anders states, myths are foundational to the constitution of the idea of the nation, I want to suggest that cultural critics have a responsibility to trace their emergence and the conditions of their possibility. But what will be of particular interest to me in this talk is not only the myth-making quality of the narratives of Polish nationhood, but also the mechanisms of fantasy, occlusion, and foundational violence that lie at the origin of such myths. As we've learned both from post-structuralist thinkers and from empirical studies of ethnic conflicts, any form of identity, no matter how loosely defined and open, is always premised on a certain exclusionary difference, a difference that functions as a constitutive outside of this identity. In the case of the Slavic narrative of its ethnic unity, Jewishness, as an ethnic, cultural, and religious concept, seems to take on the role of such a constitutive outside. Jewishness becomes an exclusionary category that feeds the identity of the central self through its appearance in myths, stories, and stereotypes, from the age-old literary narratives about the wandering Jew through to the more pernicious Nazi-inflected representations of the Jew as a parasite and non-human. Yet my presentation is not intended as a correction to the older myths, a more truthful retelling of the story of Slavic or Polish identity, but is rather a form of what Freud called Durcharbeitung, a working through. And again, we talked about the notion of working through and how it can be applied to different ethnic and neighboring conflicts yesterday. So I'm very much aware of the narrative character of my own intervention. The process of working through is also a process of storytelling. And with this reservation in mind, I want to tell you three different stories. Stories that call for what the philosopher Emmanuel Levinas has named the eye that listens. Levinas' listening eye in the sense the eye you see with, not I as in I am. So listening eye is a mixed metaphor that hints at an ethical obligation to grasp the story behind and beyond vision, beyond image or stereotype, and to stand to ethical attention before the accusatory presence of the other. These three stories will be interlinked and will provide a framework for my discussion of Polish myths and their relation to ethics, politics, and democracy. My first story or narrative is actually a bit of poetry. I'll explain in a minute why, so just bear with me for the time being. All Heraclitus' stairs, all threnodies, and plaintive dirges of Simonides, all kings and slow heirs in the world, all griefs, wrung hands, wet eyes, laments and epitaphs, all assemble, come from every quarter. Help me to mourn my small girl, my dear daughter, whom cruel death tore up with such wild force. Out of my life, it left me no recourse. Right, this bit of poetry comes from Laments by one of the most famous Polish poets. It's a big name for Polish speakers, for all those who've been through the Polish educational system. A 16th century poet, a Polish William Shakespeare, you could say, father of Polish poetry, most famous for his immensely personal collection of 19 elegies or threnodies upon the death of his beloved 2.5-year-old daughter, Ursula. As evidenced from the example I've just cited, and that poem, which as I say, everyone who's been through Polish schooling is probably knows by heart and has encountered many times in exams, A-levels. So evidence from that particular example, Poland and Polish literary history have a long tradition of almost mythical mourning, both privately and in public culture and in art. Elegiac poetry was also very prominent in the later Romantic period, when Poland was mourning her lost independence. But there is some clear exclusions to this national mourning in Poland. Indeed, it can be argued that Jews who had cohabited with Gentile Poles on the same land for over 500 years prior to World War II, and of whom over 3 million perished in the Holocaust, are Poland's great unmourned, an exclusion from the legitimate discourse and practice of mourning. As the Polish literature scholar Maria Janion puts it playfully in the title of one of her recent books, to join Europe? Yes, but only with our deceased ones, arguably advancing a suggestion that the act of mourning is conditional to forging democracy in Poland. This romantic myth of Poland as the Christ of the nations, defending the weak and taking others' suffering upon herself, provided sustenance to the Polish nation during the time of its greatest peril for more than a century of lost independence. This is why, as suggested by Jan Gross in the final paragraph of his book Fear, Anti-Semitism in Poland After Auschwitz, which came out in 2006, the Poles can't really afford to discard this heritage. However, the publication of the books Neighbours and Fear, in which Gross discusses the troubled history of Polish-Jewish relations during and after the Second World War, focusing on the pogroms of Jedwabne and Kielce, has opened a vigorous debate, both in Poland and abroad, about the viability of these myths. It has also foregrounded the difficult issue of the sustenance of such national identity during and after the war through the exclusion on a symbolic but at times also material level of non-ethnic Poles. So I want to argue in this talk via these three stories I'm telling you, interconnected with the figure of Jan Kochanowski, that even if we accept that myths are fundamental to the constitution of national and cultural identity, Poland needs to rethink both her mythology and her relationship to Jews and Jewishness. I also suggest that mourning the 3 million Jews who perished during the Second World War, mainly from the hands of the Nazis, but sometimes also from those of their Christian neighbours, is an ethical condition for the emergence of a truly democratic culture. The recognition of this need for mourning, which, as we know from Freud, is not just about death, but also about reparation and coming out on the side of life, reconciled with loss and at least partially repaired, is the first condition of the necessary questioning of Poland's mythical self-image as the Christ of the nations. So there are two aspects to this mourning. There is the need to mourn the Jewish presence, Jewish neighborliness, Jewish life that disappeared from the hands of the Nazis in Poland. Also, there is a need to name, recognize and mourn the far less numerous, but not any less important, victims of the local pogroms in Poland, in which Gentile Poles murdered their Jewish neighbors in Jedwabne, Radziwiłł, Kielce. Ewa Ziarek writes in her contribution to Imaginary Neighbors that a pathological amnesia and the loss of collective mourning for the Holocaust have marked the post-war generations. For her, this amnesia too belongs to the history of Polish-Jewish post-war relations. Ziarek points out that the Jedwabne massacre, but also we may add the Kielce and Radziwiłł pogroms, include as their essential part the disappearance of these crimes from history and memory. Addressing this disappearance, making these crimes reappear, is necessary for understanding better what is actually meant by Poland as Polishness. The act of mourning has to involve the labour of working through the painful events, pogroms, murders, the withdrawal of neighbourly hospitality, even if we are to recognise that Christian Poles were themselves the victims of the German occupation, as the argument is often kind of brought up in defence around the debate, and that ethnic Poles too had suffered tremendous losses during the period of Soviet and Nazi occupation. But this inability to speak about pogroms or other anti-Semitic excesses in Poland without falling into denial or rage is, as Ziarek points out, a symptom of the pervasive lacuna in Polish national remembrance. This lacuna or gap consists in the erasure of collective and individual memories of the Jewish life in pre-war Poland, the lack of mourning for the Jewish tragedy, and the overwhelming loss of the awareness of the absence of Jews and Jewish culture in contemporary Poland. We can perhaps go so far as to suggest that this unmourned traumatic loss of the Jewish neighbourly presence, combined with the unaccounted for sense of horror and guilt, has contributed to the strengthening of the idea of the monocultural Polish community in the post-war period. In a similar vein, Jan Gross writes in Neighbours that after World War II, Jews evoked shame and contempt, which could only be overcome by mourning. But what happened instead was the symbolic and material erasure of Jewish presence. And there were obviously multiple reasons for this. I think Gross doesn't give full account. There wasn't just greed and guilt, but also a whole network of complex social and moral circumstances that led to this erasure of presence on the material and the kind of memory level. But to acknowledge the complexity of these circumstances is not to exclude or belittle the horror of the neighbourly hostility, at times extended by ethnic Poles towards their Jewish compatriots. My own investigation of Polish-Jewish relations is therefore a belated lament. but one which is future-orientated. It's a work of mourning which is to come out on the side of life, survival, reparation. It's future-oriented, even to use Derrida's word, messianic. It's not negative or pessimistic, but I'm arguing that for Polish-Jewish relations to have a future and a life, their study must go to the moment of negativity and hopefully come out on the other side, somehow repaired, healed. So let's see how this work of reparation can be enacted in contemporary Poland. And to discuss this, I'd like to turn to another story, another piece of literature, one in which we encounter another Jan Kochanowski, this time a character in a story. So Jan Kochan is my second story now. Jan Kochanowski is the main protagonist of Marcin Karpiński's short story, The Miracle of Purim, a story to which I refer my own chapter in Imagine Neighbours. The story was later turned into a film, so the clips are from the film story. For me, this story perfectly encapsulates the vicissitudes and paradoxes of Polish-Jewish relations, or their lack, in Poland today. So let me sum the story up a bit for you. Tower block living, as many of you may know, was an urban experiment designed to facilitate the cohabitation of different social classes in socialist Poland and in other socialist countries. However, this dream has turned sour in many post-socialist countries. Dirty staircases, noisy refuge chutes, and stinking lifts covered in graffiti testify to the failure of the promise of a blissful communal life. When we first meet Jan Kochanowski, the guy in the middle, he's yet another anonymous character trapped in the alienation of caged living. Kochanowski is your average Polish guy, living with his wife and 18-year-old son in the city of Łódź, on one of those tower block estates so beloved by communist city planners. Everything about Kochanowski, a Polish anti-hero who spends his days complaining about the hardship of everyday life, and more often than not blaming it all on the Jews, seems to be just average. Everything apart from his name, that is, which he shares with the greatest Polish Renaissance poet, whose name remains engraved, as I said earlier, in everyone's memory, everyone who's been to Polish schooling. Ending to the story, we see Kochanowski going up in a scruffy lift to his flat. He lets his eyes wander aimlessly over the layers of graffiti in which football slogans compete with sexual jibes, only to stop at a faded drawing. It's a picture of a gallows with the Star of David hanging from it. Surreptitiously, Jan pulls out a pencil from his pocket and retraces the contours of the drawing. When he's almost finished, the lift comes to a sudden halt, and Jan is met by his neighbour, Mr. Holtzman, a grey-haired man with a dog on a leash. Holtzman looks at Jan for a little longer than the principles of neighbourly anonymity in a block of flats require, and then gets into the lift. Right, the above would have been just an insignificant episode in the sequence of apparently meaningless neighbourly encounters, if one day Kochanowski's life hadn't suffered a double blow. Not only does he find out that he's inherited a princely sum of money from a wealthy relative in the US, about whose existence he didn't even know, he also learns that his relative was Jewish, and that in fact Kochanowski's true name is Cohen. On top of that, the inheritance can only be accepted on the condition that Jan's family observe the principles of the Jewish faith. Torn between greed and self-hatred, Jan turns to his neighbour, Mr. Holtzman, who he always suspected of being Jewish, for information on how to properly celebrate a Purim. He also goes into the synagogue and tries to get as much information as possible about what he's supposed to do. He then prepares a festive meal, only to learn that his inheritance had already been claimed by another relative. The story ends in a drunken celebration, in a truly Purim fashion, with Jan Kochanowski Cohen dancing with joy to the applause of his wife, son, and their new friend, Mr. Holtzman. Commenting on the film version of the story, Polish critic Tadeusz Sobolewski writes that the miracle of Purim is a subversive joke, conducted in the spirit of the Purim holiday, where the participants wear costume, where the black and white division between us and others is blurred, and where the terrible anti-Semitic little Polacks are revealed to be ethnic Jews. And even though the riches they were hoping for turned out to be only a mirage, the protagonists are raised from the level of contemporary troglodytes to that of human beings. So the story I've just cited does more than just tell us about one little episode from neighbourly cohabitation, the kind of tensions and vicissitudes that we here in the UK regularly observe in Coronation Street or East Enders. The miracle of Purim also provides a narrative framework for the ubiquitous question of Judeo-Christian theology, who is my neighbour? But rather than see it as a theological quandary underlying the debate between Jewish particularism and Christian universalism, I take this question as a broader political ethical injunction. So the term neighbour, from Old English he who dwells near, contains a structural ambivalence, which defines a relationship of proximity between two individuals, families, tribes, or states, precisely via separation and difference. It would be interesting to do an etymological study in other languages where the origins of the term, of the word neighbour comes from. In Polish, it's also very similar to English. It's not he who dwells near, it's he who sits near, sąsiad. And I'm sure in a lot of languages that probably traces, as far as I remember, reading about it, but I'm not that much anymore. Seen as both a moral concept designating the physical and emotional proximity of dwellers, and a political concept used to tie community together, neighbourliness is in fact predicated on the preservation of boundaries. It is thus always already threatened by antagonism and violence. The injunction inherent in the question, who is my neighbour, compels us to address the issues of proximity, separation and belonging in a way that goes beyond the moral discourses on loving thy neighbour as thyself on the one hand, and the political discourses on nationhood, national identity and international conflict on the other. So the question of the ambivalent geographical affective nature of neighbourliness also makes us face the original ethical problem of an obligation towards the other, whose otherness precedes my consciousness, and which makes me aware of the fact that my place in the sun is not really mine. Instead, as the philosopher Emmanuel Levinas argues, this place belongs to the other, whom I may have oppressed, starved, or driven away from home, my life, and my space. For Levinas, ethics is always already primary. It's an unconditional demand placed before time on conditioned beings that find themselves put in question and challenged by what is absolutely other to them. Inspired by Levinas's ethical thinking, I contend that a responsible political inquiry into the Polish Jewish past needs an ethical supplement if it's not to be limited to the settling of accounts, a mathematical calculation of guilt and blame. Further, any debate about neighbourliness can't simply adopt a local perspective of the area studies. The interrogation of the very concept of neighbourliness needs to be situated between the complex and sometimes contradictory demands of particularism and universalism inherent in the concepts of local, ethnic, or national identity, the ideas of chosenness and land ownership, and the multiple ideologies of humanism, pan-Slavism, and cross-national collaboration. Elizabeth Gross argues that the Jew, as an idea of radical heterogeneity and familiar neighbourly presence, represents a resistance to the norms governing the citizen, the neighbour, and the Hellenic or Christocentric subject. But what kind of resistance to the neighbourly norms did the Jew offer? And what were those norms, actually? By resisting domestication into the mono-religious Catholic landscape, perhaps the Jew exposed the precariousness of a neighbourly community and the pervertibility of the hospitality upon which it was allegedly based. Never at home, wherever they were, the Jews seemed to be impossible neighbours, posing a challenge to the idea of neighbourliness seen as consolidation of identity devoid of difference, the identity of the self-same. Can we therefore support that the Polish neighbours of Jedwabne attempted to eliminate a threat to their fantasy of neighbourliness, to close the door on the other within oneself, to kill the Kohen within the Kochanowski? The tragedy of Jedwabne, in which neighbours killed neighbours, presents itself either as a logical impossibility or an act of self-killing, self-implosion. And now to my third story. My maternal grandfather was also called Jan Kochanowski. And again, this is very unusual. It's really as if your grandfather was called William Shakespeare. There was nothing extraordinary in that bigger sense about my grandfather. But the interesting thing was when I was working on the project, I was working around these two Jan Kochanowskis. So only somebody pointed out to me, and I was quite close to my grandfather. Somebody, a family member, pointed out, well, your grandfather was Jan Kochanowski. So there was this moment of forgetting and not forgetting, and realizing that there was also interesting for me. So bring on my great-grandfather here. So this realization, coupled with incessant teasing to my mother for being Jewish in her childhood, something she's always told us as an aside anecdote in the family, how people who always thinks that she was Jewish, has planted Jewishness as a lack, obligation, and constitutive part of our family identity. So to answer the question, I often get asked in relation to my interest in Polish-Jewish relations whether I'm Jewish. I can only answer, I don't know, even though my mother has always been teased about being Jewish. And as we know, we may not know, Polish family histories, genealogies, and mixtures on the genetic and blood level are very, very complicated. So probably not, but maybe, but I'm not particularly interested in tracking down and ascertaining my biological roots. Identitarian essentialism of this kind, be it ethnic, religious, national, or sexual, doesn't interest me that much. Because no matter who or what I am, I already know I carry an obligation for the unmourned Jewish losses in Poland, in me, for Jewishness as neighborliness and identity lost. Jewishness therefore becomes for me a task, a duty, and a responsibility. It's also the intertwining of Polishness and Jewishness in religion, culture, and blood that interests me, and that for me provides a hope for the survival of the Jewish trace in Poland, of Polishness and Jewish culture in the Jewish diaspora, a lifeline that can nourish us all. The possibility of telling different stories kind of leads to this possibility for inventing other, ethically better myths. If we agree with Anderson, the myths are inevitable and necessary for the survival of a cultural identity. This intertwining of the two cultures has been summed up most cogently by Viktor Seidler-Jeleniewski. Commenting on his visit to Poland, British-born Seidler writes in his very beautiful and moving book, Shadows of the Shoah, Jewish Identity and Belonging, having turned their backs on Poland, it can be difficult for the second generation to recognize just how Polish their parents were. Things that we learned to think of as Jewish turn out to be Polish. This was also true of the food, which had tastes that took me back to childhood. This was the way that food used to taste as I was growing up. The sense that no meal was complete if it didn't start with soup was also something Anna, Victor's wife, had grown up to take for granted with her family. So perhaps soup is the meeting point of past and future and present Polish-Jewish relations. So how did I travel from morning and pot roast to soup? Well, it's my attempt to come out on the side of life and survival of the fragile Polish-Jewish relations, come out on the side of nourishment. It's an attempt to rescue Zoe, this kind of biological life force, the sheer force of life, from the negativity of Giorgio Agamben's story of bear life as narrated in Homo Sacer, where he focuses on the reduction of Auschwitz prisoners to bear life, the sheer fact of living beyond its political identity, citizenship, belonging. And this is an important story that Agamben has. I'm just trying to kind of go back to this other thread to kind of work through and with Zoe. So soup in Polish-Jewish relations is important, but also, even though we must eat, we must also, as Derrida reminds us, eat well, which is to say not to take everything in, but to share the food, learning to give the other to eat. So there is a certain injunction to share the food and the story with the neighbor. But we've also been sharing this food, although sometimes we've been sharing it in separation, if such a paradox is possible. So there is some hope, hopefully, some life, perhaps, in Polish-Jewish relations. And for me, it's vital that these traces get rekindled. And now a little coda. I wanted to tell you about this recent art project that I got alerted to by friends, and an art project by a guy called Rafał Betlejewski called I Miss You, Jew. The work consists of a number of parts. One of them is photographing himself in places, in locations with an empty chair. And as somebody who, in my kind of art career, has been interested in photographing Jewish absence in Poland, but to me this so far has been only concept. By photographing Jewish absence, I don't mean just going and photographing synagogues and going and photographing schools and Jewish communities that are there, Jewish publishing houses. I wanted to capture the something that kind of is in the air. If you could perhaps photograph Polish air, maybe something interesting would come out of it. And Betlejewski's project is kind of interesting. It's visually quite naive, and for that reason, it's quite powerful. The biggest part of the project consists in painting graffiti on different walls and murals. The graffiti says simply, I miss you, Jew. And obviously evoking visual connotations of racist, anti-Semitic graffiti, something, and seeing in Poland, in Polish, the word Jew on the wall, always traditionally has only one connotation, and being arrested by police initially, for police obviously was thinking he was painting anti-Semitic graffiti, so he was arrested, he had to explain, no, actually, well, can't you see what it says? He's saying, I'm missing, but who are you missing? And he also kind of has a report, the project is bilingual, a website, www.tensknie.com, which means I'm missing you, and he's mobilizing lots of other people to paint these murals, to kind of cover Poland with an anti-Semitic graffiti. But it's also a kind of humorously serious project of working through mourning and enacting mourning differently. And there's also a memory book asking people to bring stories, because most Polish families have stories of their Polish Jewish friends who either perished or were made to emigrate in 1968, but there's also a kind of bigger and bigger Jewish community in Poland, in different cities, different towns. So this is one of the kind of interventions, again, coming out on the side of Zoe. Thank you.